Welcome to This Explainer. Today we're embarking on a seriously fascinating journey together. We are going to trace the path of virtual reality, all the way from its early, almost sci-fi origins, straight through to the absolute mind-blowing medical applications we're seeing today. But, we're not just stopping at the tech specs. We're also going to venture deep into the very real, very complex ethical dilemmas that this incredible technology is forcing us to confront right now. It's a lot to unpack, so buckle up. Okay, let's dive into this structured roadmap. First, we'll look at the surprisingly long history of VR. Then, we'll check out how it's being used today, way beyond just video games. After all that fun tech history, we're going to tackle some pretty dense, important bioethics by looking at the real harms happening in virtual spaces, the frameworks researchers are proposing for responsible use, and finally, a master blueprint for the future. I promise you, by the end of this, you are going to look at a VR headset completely differently.
Section 1. The History of VR, from whimsical origins to modern tech.
When we think of VR, right, we usually just picture the slick headsets from the last decade, but this technology actually spans centuries. We can trace the core concept all the way back to 1838, when Charles Wheatstone invented the stereoscope. He basically proved our brains could process two flat images into a single 3D object. Incredible, right? Then, in 1929, we got the Link Trainer, which was a completely electromechanical flight simulator for pilots. Fast forward to 1968, and Ivan Sutherland creates the Sword of Damocles. That was the first VR head-mounted display connected to a computer, but it was so heavy it literally had to be suspended from the ceiling. And of course, jumping ahead to 2012, Palmer Luckey's Oculus Kickstarter massive boom effectively launched the modern VR revolution we know today. Now, what's really interesting about this slide is this crazy machine from the 1950s. A cinematographer named Morton Halig created what he called the Sensorama. It was this massive, arcade-style cabinet designed to immerse you in a film. But not just with sight and sound. It actually vibrated your chair, blew wind in your face, and, get this, even generated smells. He shot short films for it, like riding a motorcycle or a dune buggy. It was just a brilliant, highly physical precursor to modern immersion. So the evolution just kept accelerating through this wild mix of military innovation and commercial ambition. In 1961, we saw the HeadSight that was built for the military to safely view dangerous situations remotely using actual motion tracking. By 1985, Jaron Lanier, who actually popularized the term virtual reality, by the way, was selling the very first VR gloves through his company VPL Research. Now, there were definitely stumbles. Sega famously tried to release a VR headset in 1993 that completely flopped because of technical issues. But by 2014, the tech had matured so much that Facebook acquired Oculus for $2 billion. That was the moment that truly signaled VR was a billion-dollar industry and here to stay. Section 2. Real-world applications today, beyond gaming and entertainment. So while gaming is obviously a massive driver for headset sales, the utility of VR has matured in ways that are genuinely life-changing. Just look at these awe-inspiring applications. The FDA recently approved a VR app called Ease VRX, which uses behavioral therapy and deep breathing to significantly reduce chronic lower back pain. Going back even as far as 1997, researchers have been using VR to treat military veterans with PTSD, letting therapists carefully control exposure to traumatic triggers. Researchers are also using it to build empathy for the environment, literally putting people in a simulated ocean to watch corals die, which drastically boosts their compassion for the environment. NASA even using it right now to teach astronauts how to handle hazardous materials in orbit.
And to truly understand just how powerful these medical applications can be, consider this vividly striking anecdote from the 1990s. Researchers Hunter Hoffman and David Patterson created an experience called Snow World, specifically for burn victims. While patients were having their extremely painful bandages changed, they were placed into a VR Arctic environment where they just throw snowballs at penguins and woolly mammoths. The immersion was so total, so completely engaging, that their brains were literally distracted from processing the physical pain. Brain scans confirmed a massive reduction in pain signals. It is just an absolutely astounding use of the technology.
Section 3. Real harms in virtual worlds. The yikes factor.
Now, as incredible as those medical applications are, we really need to talk about the dark side of this rapid technological evolution. We're entering a space where the rules just haven't caught up to the reality, and everyday users are paying the price. In a study that analyzed 300 Amazon reviews of top VR headsets, researchers found some deeply alarming stuff. One parent wrote, "While charging, the Oculus overheated and burned my 10-year-old.
Another user reported being in a virtual comedy club where a child was aggressively and offensively shouting racial slurs to harass the host. We literally have severe physical harm intersecting with intense psychological harassment, all happening right now on consumer devices. To make sense of all this, researchers categorize these ethical issues into 4 main buckets. First up, privacy and consent. We are not just talking about your email address anymore, folks. VR headsets track your eye movements, your heart rate, your emotional responses. You are generating super personal data that basically creates a biological map of who you are. Second, physical and mental harm. That ranges from physical burns and intense motion sickness to very real emotional trauma. Third is harassment. We're seeing virtual crimes, abuse, bullying, and assaults on digital avatars that feel incredibly, viscerally real to the user. And fourth, accessibility. VR requires physical capability and a lot of financial capital, which means we risk creating these advanced tools that only serve a privileged few. To illustrate just how potent the emotional risks are, researchers noted a very specific anecdote about a patient using VR for chronic pain. She was placed in a simulated forest, and out of nowhere, it triggered intense, traumatic memories of her deceased son. She started shaking and crying uncontrollably. Now, if you're in a clinical setting with a doctor, that can be managed, but imagine if that happens in an unguided consumer setting, alone in your living room without a licensed professional. That poses a massive, completely unregulated ethical risk. So, the crucial point is 33.3%. A staggering study sampling applications across major platforms like HTC and Oculus found that only 1/3 of them even bothered to mention having a privacy policy. And it gets worse. Less than 20% of those Oculus apps actually explained how user data was being handled. In an era where apps can literally map your biological responses, this lack of basic transparency is just wild.
Section 4, Frameworks for Responsible Use, Finding Our Moral Compass.
Thankfully, academics, philosophers, and developers aren't just sitting back and watching this happen. They're actively trying to map out a moral compass to fix this unregulated Wild West. Researchers generally point to 2 existing ethical frameworks that could be adapted for consumer VR. The first is the Institutional Review Board, or IRB framework. This is your classic university standard, rooted in the Belmont Report. It strictly enforces respect for persons, which means informed consent, beneficence, meaning maximizing benefits while reducing harm, and justice, ensuring equity. On the flip side, we have the Care Ethics framework. Instead of just focusing on strict rule compliance, Care Ethics actively pushes for empathy. It asks developers to intentionally create experiences that force perspective taking and elevate marginalized voices, really focusing on human interconnectedness.
But perhaps the very best rules are the ones users actually build themselves. Enter participatory codes. In one really cool initiative, 1,000 users and developers got together to co-create a code of ethics. They agreed on fundamental rules like do no harm, demanding transparency in data collection, and explicitly asking for permission. They even mandated technical standards like keep nausea away and social standards aimed at minimizing cyberbullying. When the community builds the rules together, they are far more likely to actually enforce them.
Section 5, the Ethical Synthesis Framework, a blueprint for the future.
Researchers Aruj Raja and Reem Al-Bagli recognized that no single framework was quite enough on its own, so they actually combined the best parts of them into one master blueprint. And this brilliantly illustrates that ethical journey. If you look at the bottom x-axis, we have the difficulty level of implementation. On the y-axis, we have the aspirational dimension, basically how ideal or ambitious the ethical goal is. It visualizes ethics not as some boring checklist, but as a fluid upward curve from basic, entry-level compliance all the way up to high-minded aspirational goals.
Let's break down that trajectory real quick. Every single VR app has to start at the entry point, simply doing no physical harm, being transparent about data, and getting user consent. That's the bare minimum, right? But as an app matures, it should travel the middle path, actively ensuring accessibility for all body types and incomes, and practicing beneficence, meaning the app actively does good for the user. Finally, the highest ambition, the exit point, is where VR strives to foster true empathy, promote social justice, and integrate course correction. That means the code is treated as a living document that adapts whenever ethical oversights occur.
So we've seen how VR evolved from a heavy contraption hanging from a 1960s ceiling into a hyper-realistic world capable of healing our physical pain and tracking our deepest biological responses. But the ultimate question remains. As our virtual worlds become indistinguishable from reality, will our moral codes evolve fast enough to protect us? The frameworks exist. The history proves we can innovate. Now it's really up to developers and users to demand that empathy and justice are programmed right into the matrix. Thank you so much for joining me for this explainer. I really hope this leaves you with plenty to think about the next time you strap on a headset.